So it's time for us to start the keynote session. I hope the audience is back. I can't see you, but I do see the number at least. Okay, so I will just begin. So it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker today, Professor J. Timmons Roberts. Professor Roberts is the Itleson Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at Brown University and the Executive Director of the Climate Social Science Network. Among other additional affiliation, he was a James Martin 21st Century Professor at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute in 2006 and 2007, where he met Yael, and the non-residential Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution from 2012 to 2020. Also, he recently served on the board on Environmental Change and Society of the US, National Academy of Sciences. He is a world-renowned student of climate change politics and the co-author and editor of 14 books and edited volumes, and of over 100 articles and book chapters. He is a leading expert on the tensions between the global north and south at the United Nations climate negotiations. He has also wrote extensively on other aspects of these global arenas, such as development, finance, transparency, climate adaptation, and much more. Recently, has shifted more attention to American climate politics, and particularly the obstacles before meaningful reform, something that he will probably mention in his talk. His scholarship received awards from the American Sociological Association and the International Sociological Association. Professor Roberts is also the founder and executive director of the Climate Social Science Network, CSSN, an international network of social science scholars focused on understanding the cultural and institutional dynamics of the political conflict over climate change. The network, which connects hundreds of scholars around the world, facilitates research groups, allocates grants to research projects, and serves as a source of news and information on various aspects of climate change politics. I will leave further elaboration to Professor Roberts. Timmons, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great honor. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rami. And you're hearing me okay? Everything's all right? You can see my slides. Thank you, Daniel. And Yael, it's wonderful to see you. And I'm pleased to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to speak for about a half an hour. I'll try to keep it snappy so it's not boring. And I'm sorry I can't do this in Hebrew, that I only speak English and Spanish and Portuguese. But so thank you for having me. Rami asked me to speak about challenges, opportunities, and responsibilities of social scientists in the context of the crisis of climate change. Something I care about very deeply. And I will say, as a sociologist, that we share some of the problems of social sciences in modern academia, in that work on theory and work that is appealing to disciplinary journals is given more status in the university system that I understand, unfortunately, rather than work that is of immediate practical use in addressing major social problems such as climate change. So what I'm going to call for really is a shift in the university priorities. And I like this quote on the right that you can see here from our provost, Richard Locke, who is a remarkable political scientist and leader. And he argues that in a higher education institutions are essential at this moment. And talking about mine, Brown in particular has the privilege and the responsibility to be a force for necessary change. So this is, I'm kind of signaling that I feel like there's some kind of a pivot happening. And so hopefully there's some useful direction that we can take in making that pivot. I also say that as a sociologist, it's going to be a bit biased towards sociology, but you asked the sociologist to give the talk. So I'm doing the best I can to be really transdisciplinary and to talk about other disciplines as well. So I'm going to talk about environmental sociology and its background and history, with a little bit of political science. Then they'll be talking about climate change emerging as a research topic in sociology and beyond. I'll look at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the research that's gone on there by social scientists, and then talk about this sort of expanding research on multi-level governance that is outside of the UN negotiations. And then talk about a new era of awareness of obstruction of efforts on climate change. And that's really where my efforts have shifted. And I put that 2017 as a rather clear date because that's when I shifted. So it's very egocentric and I apologize for that. And then I'll talk about, as a way to wrap up, sort of what are the responsibilities of social scientists. So just as a bit of history here, the field of environmental sociology took off in the 1970s and 1980s. And some of the leaders were people like Riley Dunlap and William Catton, who wrote this article down here in the bottom corner about a new paradigm. And they proposed that there was a shift of culture and ideology happening from one that they called the human exemptionalist paradigm, that is, humans are exempt from the laws of nature, which was the basis of much social science and especially sociology, that instincts and natural constraints did not apply to human society, to a new ecological paradigm where people suddenly realized through the ecological crisis in the 1960s that brought on by industrial capitalism, that humans are in fact subject to those laws of nature and that we need to adjust ourselves. There were some other leaders that are mentioned here. Unfortunately, they were mostly men in the first decade, and then we had more women coming in the further decades, especially in the 80s and 90s and so on. Those early approaches were largely cultural and focuses on discourses and individual attitudes. So there was quite a lot of public opinion research. There were studies of social movements. There was an exception, which I would say was led by this scholar, Alan Schneeberg, who was at Northwestern University, and his student, Ken Gould, especially, he had several students, but they focused on and developed a theory of the treadmill of production, in which they were basically using that as a euphemism for capitalism. That is, that companies under the capitalist model had to increasingly damage the natural environment and their workers, exploit their workers, in order to even just stay even with other companies. That is, if they did not, then other companies would, and they would fall off the back of the treadmill. So in order to even stay where they were or to advance in capitalism, companies had to increasingly, and inevitably, really, they saw it as an inevitable part of capitalism, that nature and workers and communities would be destroyed. Some of the other big debates is this one about IPAT. It's an identity or an equation in which we're trying to understand the total impact on the environment of human action. And you can focus on different types of impacts. In the case of climate change, we can look at carbon dioxide emissions or methane, or we could look at air pollution, whatever it is. And the idea that was put forward first by Paul Ehrlich, a population bomb author, is that impact can be understood as the result of how many people there are, the population multiplied by how affluent they are, multiplied by how efficient we are, what kind of technology we use. So the IPAT identity really was important in shaping a lot of the way a lot of people's thinking, I would say, including my own. I find it an interesting way to try to break down this problem. It's very useful for teaching. I often like to talk about it in introductory level classes as a debate between those who really focus on population, who was Paul Ehrlich, those who focused on inequality and affluence, like Barry Commoner, and I will say myself, and those who believe that we could rapidly increase our efficiency in society with a factor 4 or factor 10 improvement in efficiency, such as the Lovenses, Amory and Hunter Lovens, who were at the Rocky Mountain Institute and argued for technology. There was also this group called the Ecological Modernization School, which came out of Northern Europe. Gert Spargaarden and Arthur Mol in the Netherlands, arguing that capitalism was in fact overcoming the treadmill of production problem that I just described, and was incorporating in its core business model and planning the ecological crisis. So firms that considered their pollution, their emissions, as a potential resource that could be recycled and reused and fed into another industry would succeed, and those that didn't would fall to the wayside. This model was much debated in environmental sociology and environmental social sciences, and quite refuted for developing countries, for the United States, for other parts of the world that were not Northern Europe. I think that the models differ in different places, but the ecological modernization assumption was of a strong state that could impose regulations on industry, and in other words, a state with some relative autonomy to do the sort of the tough work of environmental regulation. David Sonnenfeld I'm mentioning here because he talked about these Nordic countries moving their technology to developing countries and doing, for example, timbering operations and paper production in Indonesia and other parts of the developing world. And he saw some examples of ecological modernization in the developing world, but I guess I see it as sort of islands of ecological modernization in a sea of the treadmill of production. A really important third area of environmental sociology was that focused on environmental justice, led by Bob Bullard and Beverly Wright, Paul Mohai, Bunyan Bryant, Dorceta Taylor, looking at the role of race and class, but especially race and ethnicity in determining who is exposed to environmental bads or environmental exposures to toxic chemicals, et cetera, in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, and their places they recreate and so on. So this is Bob Bullard's famous book, Dumping in Dixie. Much more to talk about there. Let's see here. So I'm going to move on and talk about climate change emerging as a topic. So really, it was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 that was an important date in sort of waking up sociology and even environmental sociology to the need to study climate change more. Of course, 5 documents came out of Rio, but mostly Rio is known for the Climate Change Treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was literally every country on Earth has signed and ratified it, and we all pledged to avoid dangerous climate change. But however, the trade-off I think that the US made in the deal was that we would sign it, but only if it was non-binding. So there's many social science questions on sort of what drove that position, that posture by the United States and some other developed countries that wanted to keep this from being a binding treaty. But it at least is the framework on which all these negotiations have been built. In the US, the National Academy of Science has a group called the Human Dimensions Board, which was later renamed BEX, the Board on Environmental Change in Society. And they put out this book, Understanding the Human Dimensions of Global Environmental Change, which was quite influential at the time. And the National Science Foundation put out a call for proposals. The American Sociological Association publicized it, and I read their article and about that, and then I read the book and wrote a grant proposal, which really changed my my own career. So I see this as a really important moment. I guess the book called for sociologists and social scientists to apply the theories that we already have to the issues of global environmental change, and in particular to climate change. And I had been trained in the world systems theory school. And so myself and Peter Grimes, when we wrote that grant proposal, and later Bradley Parks, an undergraduate student of mine at William and Mary, and Jody Manali actually worked on the original project as well, tried to ask really basic questions that we had not seen anybody else ask, which is, who's suffering worst and first from climate-related disasters? And I would add the sort of policy relevances. How can social scientists help us understand the patterns and prioritize what interventions might work? Who's most responsible for the problem? That's who's emitting the most, and then, what latitude is there to do better in delivering human development? However you measure that, without increasing emissions too badly, or even while reducing emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And then thirdly, who's acting to address climate change? Who's not? Who's signing treaties? Who's developing and instituting environmental policy or climate change policy specifically? And we thought that world systems theory could be useful for that. And fortunately, so did the National Science Foundation, much to my surprise as a new junior professor at the time. So on that first question on who's suffering worst and first, there's actually quite a lot of research in geography. And unfortunately, I can't see my speaker notes, but I had a list of people: Neil Adger, Emma Tompkins, and a bunch of others who were working on Nick Brooks and et cetera, working on the area of vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience to climate change impacts. And I think there's quite a lot that social science can do to help us understand these patterns and, again, prioritize the interventions. And in this case, again, geography was way ahead of the other fields and remains way ahead. There's really an explosion of work that happened in the developing world. It's now come back home to the developed world. And the enduring questions are, why is adaptation so hard? What's working? Who are the actors that will drive it forward? Is it actually sort of a pathway into acting on reducing our emissions, or is it a sort of a cul-de-sac where countries, communities, institutions like our universities or our religious organizations and so on, we make ourselves more resilient against climate impacts like rising seas or hurricanes or droughts, floods, but we don't take the next step of actually reducing emissions. So this is, it's not necessarily the case that adaptation will lead to mitigation. I thought it would, so that's why I focused on it and for a while in my research. But I really love this quote here is from this Stockholm Environment Institute working paper by Roger and Jean Casperson. This is from 2003, based on an original work of theirs from 2001. Which talks about the inequality of climate impacts. The lessons from climate change, they say, is a more general one. Risks don't register in their effects in the abstract. They occur in particular places and regions to particular people and to specific ecosystems. So this is basically an argument against sort of global models of, the global circulation models and so on that are developed by a lot of climate scientists, that we have to understand the social systems on the ground and how to understand who's going to die and or be made homeless or made unemployed or in other ways impacted by climate change. Global environmental risks will not be the first insult or perturbation in the various regions and locales of the world. Rather, they'll be the latest in a series of pressures and stresses that will add to and interact with what's come before, what's ongoing, and what will come in the future. So in some ways, back in 2001, they were really presaging a lot of the arguments made now by scholars, and I would say the young people that we are teaching are demanding us to teach about the intersection of issues like climate change with racism, inequality along lines of gender or sexuality, age, and colonial status in the world systems and so on. And so I really agree with Casperson in arguing that recognizing and understanding this differential vulnerability is a key to understanding the meaning of climate change. And to me, this is a whole agenda. And for me, it really launched 100 ships. I'm going to turn now to that second question of who's responsible for the problem of climate change. And I'm sorry, this is a bit of an abrupt change, but there's a big literature in environmental economics, especially on something called the environmental Kuznets curve. The idea that as countries' income goes up from low-income countries to high-income countries, that first there'll be a large increase in their environmental pollutants, and then they'll reach some turning point when people in their society have enough wealth to be able to care about the environment, sort of based on an idea that I've had on my slide by Ron Inglehart, a political scientist, the post-materialist hypothesis, that people care more about environmental problems when they have enough money to have their day-to-day needs met, sort of based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs from psychology. That really, environmental problems are ones that only wealthy and highly educated people care about, which was another point I was going to argue earlier, that environmental sociology weighed in on that issue. You know, do environmental problems only matter to wealthy people and highly educated people? And some of the early studies showed that, in fact, no. You know, it started often with those groups. Fred Buttle's early research showed that it started with those groups, but it quickly spread to other economic classes. And the idea, but I'm going to talk here about the international patterns. Even in international surveys, some by Inglehart, but especially by Riley Dunlap and the Gallup Foundation in 1992, one called the Health of the Planet Surveys, was the first that showed that, in fact, developing countries actually showed higher levels of concern for environmental protection, and they were more willing than some of the wealthiest countries, including the United States, to give up some economic growth to protect their environment, which to me really refutes the idea. And I would say I've published a little bit on this environmental Kuznets curve, and I find it quite a worrisome hypothesis because it only applies for certain types of pollutants. That is, very local ones where there's water pollution running in ditches outside of wealthy people's residences, or urban air pollution that's so bad that people's eyes are burning and their lungs are, you know, on fire because they have such terrible local air quality. That will drive local cleanup of local pollutants. We really don't have evidence that these kinds of environmental Kuznets curve functions for things like carbon dioxide, methane, which are global pollutants. They accumulate at the global level, and there's no, you know, immediate impact on me of all the carbon dioxide coming out of my furnace or my car, or the factories that are providing me this laptop or other material goods. So we did some research showing that if there is a Kuznets curve, it's only because the wealthy countries are shifting to a service economy and basically exporting their pollutants to the developing world, as you know, China ends up being the producer of everything. So Julia Steinberger and I did some work, including an article in Ecological Economics, showing that there is, in fact, as you use more energy per capita, in general, there's a very rapid increase in the Human Development Index, which was, of course, the index of literacy rate, and I think it's infant mortality, life expectancy, and GDP per capita, or maybe I have one extra index in there. But in later work, we ended up using life expectancy as just a simpler index of how people are doing. So you can see very poor countries can be either very low in terms of their Human Development Index, or quite high at a very similar level of energy use. And then there's these wealthier countries, some of which consume massive amounts of energy, but don't get much more bang for the buck, don't get much more human development. out of it. And if you look at the actual countries and how they're doing, in this figure, it's, sorry, I have to change my view because of my, I'm missing my legend here. So this is carbon emissions, showing that there is this same curve. By the way, this curve, what we showed in one article was that that actual curve is starting to change and it's steep. It's getting steeper, that countries are getting more human development from less energy use. And we also looked at emissions. And what we learned here from some of this work was that basically high income was not very compatible with low carbon emissions. But there are some countries, those that in what we called Goldenberg's corner after José Goldenberg, Brazilian environment minister, who said that we could in fact have good standards of living for a very modest amount of energy use. And here are the countries that are in that corner right now. And then we later did an article arguing that in fact, each group of country needs to move into this corner if we're going to be sustainable as a global society. And there's different research agendas for each. The poor countries, how do we move them or help them move into this corner where there's low emissions of greenhouse gases and high levels of, in this case, life expectancy or other human development. That's this research agenda A. Research agenda B is the countries that are down here, South Africa, Russia, etc., that are getting very poor development outcomes for high emissions or higher emissions. So how do we help them move into this corner? How do we help the wealthy countries, not lose their level of human development, but drastically reduce their emissions? And then how do we help even the countries in that in Goldenberg's corner do a little bit better, hopefully moving up, improving their human development and not increasing their emissions? So anyway, the climate change has really emerged as a research topic. I need to move faster here. There's been a lot of research at the United Nations negotiations. Peter Newell had an early book, a geographer, about NGOs, non-state actors in the global politics. There's a few others. Some of us university people bring our students as part of delegations. And it's just a target-rich environment for social scientists because there's experts, there's delegates from countries, there's representatives from industries of all sorts, renewable and fossil fuel industries and all kinds of other experts and so on to interview and observe in action. There's a new group called the Least Developed Countries University Consortium on Climate Change, which is organized out of ICAD in Bangladesh. That's where it's headquartered. And then there's, I think, 10 other universities that are in this. Some of this all got going after the Paris Agreement. And there's also a group called the RINGOs, the Research Institution Non-Governmental Organizations that attend the negotiations and have observer status. So for those wishing to go and wanting your university to get better connected, there are these different consortia and so on. Another is actually focused on greening our universities. This one I've actually did not know about until researching for this talk, called the University Climate Change Coalition. Unfortunately, this is very US focused, but they have some nice materials on their website, including a paper on a new part that they're talking about research for policy and focusing on leadership in higher education. This is about carbon pricing. So they say that some things that universities can do are, implement internal pricing, encourage research, talk to local electricity providers to, demand they provide you renewable electricity or renewable electricity based on renewable energy, engage in developing policy, conduct face-to-face meetings with elected representatives, emphasizing university support for climate legislation, supporting student activism on campus and outside of campus, which I think is really interesting to see. These are presidents of the universities that are part of this coalition. So they're actually saying, we're going to support student activism, and then importing public campaigns, which means environmental NGOs. One thing I observed over my time going to the UN negotiations is that there was really a drift away from faith in multilateralism to solve climate change, as the UN really has struggled. So, you know, we're at COP26, we're headed on COP27, that is Conference of the Parties. So there's really been a shift to focusing on multi-level governance at all levels, local, state, private companies, institutions like our universities, our religious organizations, and so on. And this group called Earth Systems Governance and the journal has sought to try to make some sense of all these different levels of research. And I have to say, I'm honestly a little skeptical of the ability to weave it into either a coherent intellectual project or honestly a coherent governance system. This is really a big issue for debate, and I'd like to discuss much more, but it's certainly worth a try. That it's so complex and it doesn't in some ways add up to a coherent or binding system of pledges for action on climate change that can be seen as binding. And that's why I think the UN Framework Convention and all these UN negotiations continue to be important and relevant, is because they are really still the only globally representative of the people in countries who are hopefully democratically elected or somehow chosen by culturally appropriate and agreed ways to deal with climate change and make their own pledges through the Paris system of nationally determined contributions. However, we need a real binding international treaty, in my opinion. So just and just to say, there's finally been consolidation in sociology, at least, of some of the knowledge about climate change and sociology. So this is just a landmark volume by Riley Dunlap and Robert Brule, which came out in 2015 after 6 years of work, addressing this whole series of issues. And it's sort of a who's who in American environmental sociology. This was put out by the American Sociological Association's Environment and Technology section. I'm going to keep moving on this. I mentioned 2017 as a really important date for the study of obstruction to climate change, and it was very egocentric. And the reason is that, we have the science, we know that climate change is happening, it's human caused, it's terrible. We know what the causes are, what the things that we're doing are that are creating climate change. We have the technology of renewables and efficiency and reorganizing society to make it sustainable. We have policy tools that can help, even within our system, which has some deep inherent problems, but we still have tools that could be extremely helpful. But nations continue to not act really adequately. And that's almost true of every country, that we're not acting adequately. I think there's great social science questions that have to be answered. Why are nations taking the positions they are? Why is there no binding treaty? Why are the promises so inadequate? Why is there no mention of fossil fuels until this mention of coal phased down in the Glasgow negotiations about 2 months ago? So the picture, of course, is the 2017 withdrawal of my former president from the Paris Agreement in the Rose Garden of the White House. And this is with his gesture is talking about the amount of impact that the reduction of US emissions would have under the Paris Agreement compared to the emissions of China and the problem of the global emissions. So it was a case of whataboutism, as we call it, that is, what about China or what about other countries? We won't make a difference unless China also does, or does first. So there's much to be understood. I brought Robert Brule to Brown University. After this, I shifted my whole research focus from the global level down to the US. I took my research team back home to Washington, DC now, instead of going to the negotiations, and focused on climate denial, delay and obstruction in the United States. And then we just founded, with some foundation funding, the Climate Social Science Network, which is now a network of about 250 scholars from around the world, looking into this topic of the cultural and institutional dynamics of political conflict over climate change. So, and for shorthand, we really want to understand obstruction. Why do we know what the solution is? We know what the problem is, but we can't move our societies. So when the CSSN got much larger than we expected, we immediately realized that we needed to create working groups. Here's the 8 groups that we have. It's all on our website at cssn.org. We welcome the interest of scholars. There's a contact form at the back of the website, which people can submit a note to us with a little bit about your background. We're looking for peer-reviewed research scholars who are looking at issues of obstruction from many different ways, and we're open to new working groups. This is headquartered at Brown University. We put out working papers, we put out research reports, primers, and position papers. Some of these are coming out of the working groups, some of them are coming out of smaller teams. We also provide grants and a postdoc, and we've had some journalist fellows as well. One of the key outputs, which I would encourage people to look at, is a primer by Bob Brule, which talks about this structure of obstruction and the whole series of organizations that are, and flows, the types of flows of influence that are trying to influence the political agenda and policy outcomes on the issue of climate change. And I think this is really quite transferable to many other issues, and with some adjustment to other countries. This was focused on the US. So I'm now up to the final issue of responsibilities of social scientists. In case it wasn't clear from this whole talk, I think that sociologists and other social scientists have a responsibility to be relevant, to be strategic, and to be public. We need to take our work out into society and talk to the right people, and in some ways counter some of these paths of influence with our own efforts at affecting the political agenda through affecting the media agenda and the public agenda through much more savvy communications work and direct communications with policymakers. So this is the model of my climate and development lab at Brown University. We came up with this about 12 years ago, that we co-identify topics to research. You don't have to come up with all these by yourself, working with partners. This is this research institute in Bangladesh. This is a Washington-based group, Climate Investigation Center, that studies climate obstruction in the US. We do team-based research. We often put out policy briefings. We do blogging and tweeting, press releases, side events, and we've done briefings in Congress 3 years in the US, at least to talk to those who want to hear us and their staffers. We take on board input, and then we turn them into scholarly journals and books, which we find are more useful for lawyers and for scientific assessments and so on. And I would also make a pitch for local engagement. I mentioned this, that universities can be engaged in wherever they're located and try to change the policy in their cities, states, regions, subnational states, or in their nations. So just as a bit of experience that I've had here in Rhode Island, we first helped get passed a bill called the Climate Risk Reduction Act of 2010. Then we helped get past the Resilient Rhode Island Act in 2014. And then we worked for 5 years on a carbon pricing bill called Energize Rhode Island, which failed even to get out of committee. Here I am testifying as an individual, not as a representative of my university, but trying to convince this is the Senate Environment Committee of our state legislature, because Rhode Island is quite a small state. I loved it, that you sort of feel like you're at a dining room table, trying to convince your family that something's worth doing. And then these are examples of students, organizing public pressure campaigns outside the state legislature. So I think I am done. I'm going to stop there, and I quite look forward to your input. My email is up here. It's just timmons@brown.edu, and our lab is at the Climate and Development Lab, and I'm on Twitter, and I look forward to talking to people. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The applause in Zoom format is not always a problem, but imagine strong applause. Thank you so much. This was very informative, at least for me, and fascinating and admirable. And yeah, so I do have some questions, and I'm still waiting. I'm waiting for questions from the audience. So maybe I'll ask first the panelists if you want to ask something, and if you don't, so I can start. Oh, I see something that came from David Levy. So thanks for the presentation, Timmons. I appreciate the map of obstruction, but wanted to ask about the role of states who appear to have internalized the interests of business or been captured by business. So if you can relate a bit to that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Is there any more? Yeah, do you want to elaborate on the question?
Well, yes, the map of obstruction was focused on business, think tanks, you know, the role of media, and yet, you know, that's transmitted through states one way or another at these negotiations, and it's states that aren't taking action. And it's just my observation from the city level to the state in the US to the national level that these people see themselves as the head of Boston Inc. or USA Inc. And they think in terms of economic interests primarily. And you know, what do you think of the channels for this? Is it just business pressure, or how much is the ideology, neoliberal ideology, really infiltrated into their heads and the way that they think about how to manage the state?
Oh, I mean, you're absolutely right, and there's no question that states often end up in that capacity. Part of it is what's called agency capture, right, by companies and industry organizations, trade groups, influencing directly the individual representatives of those agencies. But then I think you're right that the ideology then carries on through the histories we're trying to understand. For example, in one research team project I'm on, where did it become understood that the U.S. interest was to obstruct any effort to include loss and damages from climate change impacts from the UN treaties? Why is it in the interest of the U.S. to deny the poorest and most vulnerable developing countries the ability to gain some kind of compensation, or even to have an insurance mechanism to help them, which was proposed in 1991 by Vanuatu. So, yes, I'm trying to understand what goes on in the U.S. State Department, in public affairs ministries. How does that ideology get carried forward? Where do national interests come from? And I think you're right. A lot of it has been successfully influenced by neoliberal, think tanks, academic. That's why academic programs are so important. Really, the influence of very, the powerful universities, even within a country, the ones that are linked most closely with the heads of agencies and politicians, leading politicians. And I think, Robert Bruhl has argued that there's sort of this long-term approach by, in our case, the conservative movement, to shape that ideology, that it has been going on, and they see sort of universities developing the intellectual justification for whatever that policy is. But indeed, you're right. Much of it is they're seeing the need to advance the interests of businesses because they're in what's O'Connor called the fiscal crisis of the state, right? That states need tax revenue and they need jobs to show that they're being successful as states. So I think it's really a contradiction in capitalism that they're often unable to look at the broader social contract instead of just favoring the corporate approach.
Thanks.
Long answer.
Thanks for joining, and thanks for joining today. That was
My
great.
pleasure. Love your question.
Danny, please.
Thanks, טימונס, for a fascinating review. I think that climate sociology is sort of in its embryonic stages in Israel, and for many in the audience, this overview has really been illuminating. I certainly found it that, and I'm particularly thankful for your account of what's going on in the climate social science network. I think that's also very, very relevant for many of us. In Tel Aviv University, the new master's program in climate, society, and policy, as well as the new climate center of the university are, I think, sort of natural candidates for some kind of cooperation in the future with CSSN. So thank you for that. I also have a question about carbon subsidies. Is there work within CSSN that sort of focuses on the political economy of carbon subsidies, which, as we all know, has been estimated by the World Bank as probably equivalent to $6 trillion, more or less the national budget of China, and 75% of the American federal budget. We're not counting state budgets. So this is a huge issue with obvious inroads for a critical social science. Anyone working on this at CSSN or in other frameworks that you can indicate?
Yeah, I guess I would say the answer is no, in that I'm aware of in CSSN, and I welcome you to come on board and propose it if you want to create an international working group to bring together some people and energy to take on the topic, because I agree with you, it's huge. I would say, just as an observer, that it's a good investment on the dollar or the euro or whatever currency for businesses and business associations in fossil fuels to invest in lobbying and political contributions and etc. to push for these subsidies. It pays itself back, and as you said, many fold. I think somebody did a calculation; it was like 2,000% return on the investment. So I think it's a great topic.
Thank you. Further questions?
We have an anonymous attendee question. You want me to take a swing at that one?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
So the question is, what's the role of economic processes, including the insurance sector, which provides cover for corporations which take damage from climate-related issues while allowing them to continue their practices in driving the climate crisis? Yeah, and there's some interesting work, and I think it's entirely needs some much better social science, but on the insurance sector and how it, in some cases, is really creating a moral hazard. For example, in the case of crop insurance on agriculture, if farmers buy insurance that will protect them when there's a year of bad production or a series of years, then they may continue to take non-adaptive action or maladaptive action, or they'll be slow to adapt. If those insurance, however, is contingent upon, requires the farmers to make adaptive investments, switching to drought resistant crops, or installing irrigation or something like that, then sometimes it can be adaptive. But I think that anyway, there's many sides to this. But in the United States, for example, flood insurance for properties, including homes, is highly political and is not at all paying for itself. The taxpayers are funding basically coastal property owners to get cheap insurance, which allows them to keep building and living in highly vulnerable coastal areas. And certainly that's the case for, in other industries moving forward. So many economic processes need to change. That's the second part of the question here. And I would say some of them are making sure that insurance actually pays for itself, that it's not being pushed back on taxpayers, or allowing actions that are maladaptive. And anyway, there's so much more to go on about that. But I think I'm just remembering for Dan Rabinowitz's question that there's some work being led by Haro van Asselt at the Stockholm Environment Institute on the role of the fossil fuel industry on things like fossil fuel subsidies. And I think it would be interesting to look at, I believe there's been some other work on the insurance industry out there, but not under the CSSN banner yet.
Thanks. So maybe two questions from myself. So one of them is about so your view on global climate politics. Which do you think is the bigger problem before progress? The corporate, the obstruction coming from business interests, which is obviously a big problem, or perhaps the international disagreement, especially between North and South. And perhaps maybe you can comment on how these two forces combine in obstructing, or maybe on the other hand, providing an opportunity for change. So this would be one very small question, theoretical one. And the second, more about the CSSN. So what does it take to become a member there? What kind of, which kind of scholars are members? What happens when one becomes member? Yeah, so what does it mean? What membership means?
Yeah, well, let me answer the second one first because it's easier. Anyway, so again, on the website, there's a contact page. It sends an email to myself and Trevor Culhane and Stephanie DeMassa Hansen, and we then screen the people who are interested, and we then send a Google form, and people just fill it out, showing what your recent publications are and some of your press hits and so on, when you've been quoted in the media and so on. And we put you on the website. We need a headshot. I mean, that's basically all you need to do. After you've sent us something, tell us something about how your work has in the past or will in the future relate to the issue of obstruction of climate action at any level, in any way, and convince us that you want to be in the organization and want to help move us forward. It's really, we're really growing. What else? What happens when you do join? You'll then be eligible for our grants, which we've, we're able to give away 12 grants to, I think, 24 scholars in 15 or 20 countries this last year. We have 1.5 years left on our current funding cycle. We, of course, are hopeful that we'll get renewed, but we can't assume it. So we just yesterday late in the afternoon, announced our new round of funding. So we have 1 year of funding to give. We also have a postdoc that we announced yesterday. So I guess I would say for scholars, there's the opportunity to be in working groups, which provide sort of community of other people that care about things that you care about, hopefully. We provide communications help with a specialist, Stephanie, who's been working in climate change communications for 15 years and knows all the reporters around the world. And we have a network that we work with of media, sort of unbranded public relations to help get studies out. So if you're doing a paper that you think is relevant and should be covered in the media, we help develop press releases and push it out on our Twitter feed and push it directly to selected reporters who we think might cover it. We provide briefings. We do some online members only briefings about how to work with the media, how to make policy relevant outputs. We're going to do some more on methodology and on online security and so on for researchers in this area, how to do what we call Freedom of Information Act queries. That is how to force governments to give you the information that you need, where to uncover good information in archives and so on like that. On your first question,
I just say before we continue that we have about 2 minutes until we need to end this session. So it seems like a classical two minutes question and answer.
Let's make sure we don't have anything. You have a question from Daniel Orenstein about skeptics in Israel.
So you can address this one.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure I can address that one really, about how to deal with very skeptical colleagues. I think there's some great materials out there. One called Cranky Uncle, and another from John Cook has a center in Australia that really focuses on how to talk to skeptics. And I'm not an expert on that. The Union of Concerned Scientists has some good materials as well. And the Geophysical Sciences, the GSU, I think has some materials as well. But I did want to talk about your question because I love it. It might be my research agenda for the next decade now that you've suggested it. On which is worse and how are they connected, the influence of business or the international north-south tension in terms of gumming up the UN negotiations and getting to a global binding adequate treaty. I think my easy answer will be it's both and, right? They're both extremely corrosive. There's a lack of trust between the global south and the global north that has, Brad Parks and I talked about it, and then in our book, Power in a Warming World, Dave Siplet and Mizan Khan from Bangladesh. And I argued that is really the crux of the problem at the negotiations. And I would argue that some of that trust is due to the role of business in the north successfully driving lack of adequate action, and unwillingness to really commit to the solution that's needed to save our species. So, but I like your question begs a more sophisticated answer that I'd like to work on. So thank you for it.
Of course. Okay, so this is the end of this session. Timmons, thank you so much for doing this and coming and giving this horizon broadening lecture, which is badly needed. And we hope to draw some inspiration and to keep in touch.
Great, and I'll get off, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your event, if it's not ending now. So take care.
Thank you so much. You too.
My pleasure.